Hi, my name is Susan Wanmer, and I'm presenting today with Yolanda. Yolanda, would you like to introduce yourself? Say your name.
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. I'm Yolanda van Gellecum, and I come from cooperative bonds, and I am also a director at NENA, like Susan as well.
Fantastic. So the theme of our webinar today is called Strengthening Local Economies. If you do have questions about anything that comes up today, we thought perhaps the best way to do that would be to email nina@neweconomy.org.au. That's also on the website. If you wanted to speak to either of us individually, probably checking out our LinkedIn under our names would be the best way to do that.
I'd like to acknowledge the lands on where I'm meeting from, which is the belongs to the Yagara and Yugambeh peoples, based in the southern outskirts of Brisbane and bordering on the northern parts of the Gold Coast. And I'm literally right on the border of these two regions, which is then shared by and divided by the Logan River. So I'd like to very much pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, in my community and communities across Australia, and share my gratitude to the wisdom of local elders, particularly some of the local aunties that have really shaped and influenced my life, and hopefully made me somewhat a more graceful and compassionate person. So please, I'd love to encourage you to then share the lands from where you're meeting today on the chat, and then we'll go from there. Back over to you, Susan.
Thank you. And while you're doing that, just popping that in the chat if you feel inclined to. I'm coming to you from Bundjalung country, which is Byron Bay, northern New South Wales, Northern Rivers, as it's commonly referred to. So what we're looking at today in the topic is strengthening local economy. And the reason for putting on this event today is because we're celebrating World Localisation Day. Now, the World Localisation Day was the 21st of June, but it's become so popular that events have been run all across the planet in the entire month of June, and we just snuck in here on the 30th of June to get one in. We've also got one in Byron Bay coming up on this weekend as well, so people are sort of trickling on. So World Localisation Day, spelt in a Z, with a Z if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, but for Australia we spell it with an S, was begun by Helena Norberg Hodge, and that's her organisation's name is Local Futures. So if you want to look at any further into that, Local Futures is the organisation. They decided to celebrate localism and localisation and put a day on behalf of that whole movement of bringing things back and becoming more local again. They do a day, and then the day's grown into a month. So for any of you who are a bit mystified as to why the day is happening on the 30th, that's the reason why. And so we're doing that to celebrate and to focus on localisation. And it also provides a pathway for us because the NENA conference is happening between the 10th and 12th of October this year. And the theme for that is around thriving pathways. So we're looking at bioregional governance and localisation and all sorts of fabulous topics in that as well. So we thought it would be a nice flow on from today's webinar heading towards the NENA conference as well. We only run that every 2 years, and we've got a lineup of about 30 speakers happening already up on the Gold Coast in Broadbeach. So, Yolanda, we've got, well, perhaps I'll do the 3 topics. We've condensed what we're going to speak about today into 3 topics because this is such a huge area. And the 3 topics that we've chosen are power, governance, and profit. So we're going to go through those 3 and try to explain what we are understanding by strengthening local economies through that. Yolanda, can I pass over to you?
Absolutely. And I think, Susan, you were wanting to provide a definition of economy, which I think is brilliant. You know, it's coming back to basics in that space.
Yeah, sure. So this is something I only found out more recently in my journey. And so if we think about the word economy, and sometimes people will talk about different types of economic theories or perhaps modern economy, but if we take it right back to the definition of the word, and these are in Greek, I speak French, but I don't speak Greek, so I'm going to butcher the words. But we have two definitions that were used apparently back originally in Greek times, and I'm sure half of you here on the call know that at least. But one of the words was describing the management of the household. And the consideration with that was around the management of the household and the contribution and the impact on everyone in the household and the allocation and distribution of resources. And it was a long-term view. So managing that household, the word was oikonomia, I've butchered it, which apparently means management of the household. In contrast to that, the other form of economic management back in Greek times was crematistica or crematistics, I think it's called in English these days. And that is the management of money. So it's more a political management of money. And if I refer back to my notes, if crema means money, then we've got a short-term view, and it's around maximizing and manipulating the property and the wealth to maximize short-term monetary gain. And the focus there is on the exchange partners and considers the parties in the transaction and maximizing the benefit to them. So you can hear a very different version of what economics was and could have been. And perhaps as we go through today, you'll hear how one has become perhaps the dominant term that we use. We don't refer to the Greek word, but it's the dominant term that we use today when we're talking about economics. Did that sum it up okay for you, Yolanda?
Yeah, beautifully. And I think it really reflects sort of modern definitions as well about, the real economy, which is the economia part of the definition, that producing goods and things that people need versus the kremstia. I'm not sure how to pronounce it myself, but
Premistikia, something like that. Yeah.
We'll go with the flow, but and we'll be unpacking some of that today because that's what's causing a lot of the challenges in globally, not just in society, but globally, in that the financialization, which is really about taking more and more goods that are used for, really fundamental human needs like housing or farmland, and turning that into investment so we can start to speculate and monetize that. So I think having that division in mind is really, really useful. So thanks, Susan.
So the idea of the webinar today was for us to be in conversation with each other. So if it does feel a bit chatty, that is the way we've actually set it up, is we throw the ball backwards and forwards between the two of us. So we've defined the word economy into those two different versions there. And then we come back to the word local and what does that mean? So we're going to suggest that local would be as close as possible to where you actually are. So, for example, if you're reading labels, if you can get something as close to where you live, work, or play, then you're reducing food miles if it's food, or fuel use, in other words. But more importantly, you're putting money back into your close by area, into your local area. If you're shopping at a supermarket, if you do that and you're looking at fruit, for example, doing something like reading the label to make sure that, was this orange grown in California or was this orange grown in Australia? So it may not be from your local area because not all areas grow everything. But if it's from Australia versus an import, it's still more local than if you don't think about it and just buy an orange perhaps that's come from usually from America. Yeah. And then we've got the word strengthen. So Yolanda, do you want to take the word for strengthening?
I think so. Yes, thanks, Susan. I think, and of course, there would be a lot of dimensions to this, but I think in terms of when you spend locally, you're keeping spending local. So you're getting that multiplier effect where your dollar, if it's spent at the local bakery, the local baker might hire the local accountant to do their books, or get perhaps a local supplier to supply their flour and so forth. And so in this way, you get this multiplier effect of money staying locally and allowing that local economy to stay healthy and really then meet sort of those fundamental human needs of having enough money to live on and allowing that flourishing for local people. And then, of course, if we start to then decide to spend our money on perhaps, international franchises rather than say, like a major food franchises versus a local restaurant, a lot of that money then gets lost out of the economy. We have leakage out of the economy. And so that money no longer is able to then employ local people. And so that then confounds things like youth unemployment or unemployment more generally, and the capacity for the community to stay strong economically.
Very well expressed.
Yeah.
And over the weekend, we ran a workshop, a full-day workshop for World Localisation Day here in Byron Bay. And one of the things that we used was a locally sourced burger for the lunch. And I think Sally's online today, so she'll be having a smile at this. And if you are listening to the recording, then when I said the weekend, we're in June at the moment, June 2025. So what I did, and I almost put it in the background, but I didn't because the drawing was a bit faint. But what I did is I took the burger and I actually drew the container it was in, the buns, the meat patty, the lettuce and the tomato. And then we had arrows out from that showing the people who'd grown it. So the farmers, where the tomatoes came from, where the lettuce came from, where the beef was grown, where it was processed, and right down to the container, which they told us was home compostable within 120 days. So the reason for doing that was to help us be mindful and conscious as we were eating that food, apart from it being delicious. But as Yolanda just said, all that money stays in the local community. And so the people getting the money for the tomatoes, the lettuce, the beef, I know this just sounds ridiculously simple, and you're probably thinking, why are we sitting here listening to this? It's because when you can think about it in those terms, and one of our farmers actually said at the event that she can tell because they support other producers, she can tell that their farm and the other farms that they support, she can tell from the school community and the community around them that their farm feeds back into the other farming families, and then the money from that goes back into the local community. She can actually see that ripple-on effect happening. So for her as a farmer, but also a farmer who supports other farmers because she's bigger, she said she can feel how that's helping create that thriving local economy. But we don't talk about it as an economy. She just said thriving local community instead. Now, if you compare that to a franchise burger and you think about eating that, maybe it tastes the same, but it's been flown in or imported from somewhere different. That money, as Yolanda said, that's the leaky bucket effect. And so economically, the money leaves the country. Perhaps it stays in the local area to pay for your fast food chain staff or a manager of those staff, but pretty much cleaners perhaps. But apart from that, the money goes out of the country. And that is impoverishing. It doesn't actually help us to be strong, and it doesn't help to build our strong local economic community.
Well done, Susan. So, Susan, I wonder, because a lot of this then sort of feeds back into power. So, the sort of the lobbying power and the commercial power of large organizations that then swamp the power of local businesses and communities to have a sense of control and ownership over sort of the economies of their local areas. And I wonder if I could sort of maybe zoom out and look at a little theoretical framework that I found incredibly helpful to kind of sort the hay from the chaff in terms of predicting behaviours with different types of mindsets. So if you're happy for me to, I might ask Sarah to share that first slide.
Sure.
That'd be wonderful.
And is this under our power heading?
That's under power. Yeah, absolutely.
So of the 3 topics we're covering, which is power, governance, and profits, this is our power section.
Yeah, absolutely. And the conversation will intertwine, of course, because all the topics kind of coordinate together.
It's an ecosystem, isn't it?
It sure is. So this is the work of Riane Eisler, who published her seminal book back in 1987 called The Chalice and the Blade. Now, Riane Eisler is a cultural historian but also a systems scientist, and in her founding years also a lawyer. So an incredible sort of scope of background that she was able to then take this research. And her research question was, where does violence come from? And so she studied cultures across the globe, predominantly Western cultures, but also some Eastern cultures as well. But not only modern cultures, she went right back through anthropological records, archaeological records. She then drilled into academic research articles as well. So that there was a huge data set that she drilled into. And through that process, she developed this beautiful, elegant scale, which is almost the equivalent of the elegant equation of E equals mc squared, which can explain so very much. And what she discovered was that cultures from as small as a family right through to the global level, it doesn't matter where they sit in terms of size, can be mapped to this scale. And so on the one side of the scale, we have what's called the partnership model. And these are models of power. So we have here the partnership model where people treat each other with equivalence. Power is shared. People tend to be, to participate, take on responsibility, and then choose and make decisions more democratically. Value orientations tend to be intrinsic, where we want to share care with others or have universalistic care and benevolence towards others. And so there's a lot of cooperation that happens in the space, and she termed that metaphorically as the word linking in that space. And it's beautifully reflected in the little icon at the top of the partnership model, where you kind of see this hemisphere of nodes that are then interlinked. And so
the like the seed of life. In sacred geometry, it looks like the seed of life on that.
Okay. Yeah. I'll have to ask you about that, Susan. And so actually the majority of human existence, probably our first 290,000 years, if we assumed we've been around for 300,000 years, according to the science, humans lived in nomadic bands, or even when they started to farm, even in Neolithic times, people very much lived this way. And there's a considerable evidence to show that people are actually averse to sort of hierarchical power structures. And when they were living in this way, it was a very active process of sort of cutting down the tall poppies and living in this very egalitarian structure. Then sometime over the really around the past 8,000 years, things shifted to more of a domination model, and we would anticipate there were environmental changes, technological changes, and probably a combination of those. The theory isn't set on why, even though there are hypotheses. But power shifted towards a domination model. And here you start to then shift from distributed decision making, and polycentric means you have many decision centers, so poly being many, to more concentrated centers of power. So power becomes more unitary. Then, of course, the word autocratic means auto meaning the one. So you tend to have a boss or a king or a monarch at the top, or a president at the top. Politics then moves from being participatory and democratic to then essentially authoritarian, right through to dictatorial if you're going into extremes. And then the values orientation becomes extrinsic. So you motivate, rather than people motivating themselves intrinsically wanting to contribute, you motivate through carrots and sticks, so incentives and punishments. And so punishment becomes a real form of control in that space. And in modern times, that would be, for example, the threat of losing your job, or the threat of being judged by other people. And then the metaphor for that becomes a pyramid. So you have this pyramid of the people at the bottom, the have-nots, the people in the middle, that have sums, and then the people at the top who are the have-lots. And you get this really strong social ranking, which turns, and I won't go into it too much, but it really turns on a specific psychology in our brains. We have very motivation centers that really run alongside both these models. And the key part is that societies, institutions, corporations, it doesn't matter what, because these are relational dynamics, how we relate to each other, can be mapped on this continuum, and they are dynamic because they can change depending on what circumstances they are, particularly through crisis, like a complex system. When you have a crisis, it tends to reset and find a new equilibrium. This is exactly the same idea. And so the degree of orientation to either the partnership or the domination end makes for then very different social systems, as I have got written here. And so you bring out different human traits that are possible within us. So one end you bring out compassion and sharing, the other end you really bring out judgment and sort of that greediness. So please go right ahead, Susan, because I was just going to wrap that up, because
yeah,
this then we can map our corporations on this, of course. Before I go on, you go first, Susan.
Oh, just to say that when Yolanda and I were talking about this and deciding on the 3 topics that we'd try and put everything under, power came in, and this is such a beautiful model to describe those. Well, I see it as being those 2 forms of economics that we defined previously. But in our discussion together, we actually were looking at the fact that you've got the power dynamics which happen in between people. So people in a workplace or people in a group, you can get people going more towards a domination or a partnership kind of a model. But also systemically, it goes back to how are the people who actually decide the rules and make the rules, what model are they following as well? So if you've got people systemically creating a system which is towards a domination model, then you've got people in workplaces where they're working under a domination model as well. And it's very hard to change the culture when you've got a systemic domination model actually running. And how does that tie into the economy in the way that you land on?
Absolutely. So we can see examples of that in terms of the businesses that are present in the economy. And we have the whole range, which is wonderful to know. So on the left, we would have, for example, organizations that share decision making, that share resources and surpluses. So they would be cooperatives and community ownership models and employee ownership trusts, which is a big movement. There are different forms of shared ownership that you see, even for example, council owned utilities, like water and so forth. That's still community owned in a sense. So they would kind of start to be in the left, although council is still a very hierarchical way of administering that. So they might not be quite so on the partnership side. Then if you go to the other extreme on the continuum, I'm envisaging, the very large shareholder corporations that are extracting value, perhaps polluting local communities, where you have just a handful of people. Typically, there would only be a handful of shareholders that have the controlling stake in their organizations, for example, and perhaps the executive team and the board. It might amount to maybe 20 or so people that really hold the reins of an organization. So you've got this really concentrated autocracy of power that then, because there's no other stakeholders that can make a dent in their decisions, or very little, the system really then comes to serve them. And then the more money that these corporations accrue, they can put a lot of pressure on local governments, who then, perhaps back down from what these organizations want, because they're so wealthy. They can, for example, put adverts out to undermine local politicians and all sorts of shenanigans that go on. So that would be the other extreme. And of course, you've got all sorts of businesses that would range in the middle. Yeah.
And so we decided to use the word power, but we could break that into the 2 parts, where we've got power over and power under. So to have power over, you have to have a power under as well. And you'll see that play out where you've got the bully and the victim, or you've got the dominant person and the submissive kind of a person. Power over, power under. We decided not to talk about power over because it sounds a bit like a bit of jargon, and we decided to talk about domination instead, domination and partnership. So Yolanda, I'm just looking at the time to make sure that we stay within our time frame today, because I know we could talk about this for absolutely hours. Are we heading into looking at governance, how we're actually
Yeah.
creating the rules and following the rules.
Yeah, absolutely. And here again, I'd like to maybe sort of it intertwine with what's going on with our major corporations that are causing, I guess, a lot of the pollution and a lot of the unhappiness in our local communities,
Hmm.
and touching on the governance model in that, and then eventually finding some grassroots ways of what we can do about that as well.
That'd be great. And
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we need to mention as well is the fact that a corporation or a company has legal standing as a person. And so when we're looking at organizations, I probably for about 30 years have been listening to business schools, management training, business coaches since they've been invented, the ATO when it runs workshops. I listen to accountants. I look at everything I possibly can to tell me what other legal entities that somebody could create, would know to form if they were thinking about starting a business. And pretty much I only ever hear sole trader, partnership, company. Occasionally I hear trust. I never hear cooperative. I never hear foundation. So I could say from 30 years of field research in this area that it's just, oh, you want to start a business? Well, you can be a sole trader partnership or a company. So putting that aside and just focusing on a company or a corporation, and we were talking about this the other day, weren't we? We've got two categories of companies. You can have a private unlisted company or a publicly listed company. So let's be really clear. When we're talking about damage that's caused to the environment, it's usually by a publicly listed company. In some cases, it can be a private unlisted company. That would be a smaller type of company. But keep in mind as well, because I'm not quite sure who we've got in the audience, you can tell we're wanting to not leave anyone behind, but we're not wanting to dumb it down too much either. Keep in mind that the mum and dad business might have got some good advice from their accountant, which had said, you're better off setting up a PTY Ltd company than working as a sole trader. It's better for you for a bunch of reasons under accounting law. That's a company. It has legal standing exactly the same as a really huge privately unlisted company, but also the same legal standing as a listed company and a public listed company. So we're talking about the same legal structure, but what we're focusing on is the damage that can be caused when a company which must make a profit, it's driven to make a profit, when it does that in a way that it's maximizing efficiency, maximizing growth, and trying to limit the inefficiencies, and then causes harm to people, place, and planet as well. That's the damage side of things. Yeah.
Thanks, Susan. And I think what Eisler captures beautifully too is that it's not so much the structure, or even if we look at whole society of whether it's left or right, or east or west, or whether we have a corporation or some other structure, the nub of the kernel of where the problems come in is where you have too much centralized governance. It's too much control with a central group or a central authority. That's when you'll see all these things play out, no matter what structure you have in place. But as soon as you start to decentralize governance, and governance means to, shared decision, how decisions are made between a group of people who have a shared goal, and what rules they produce, and how they hold each other accountable. So that's what governance is. And as soon as you're able to bring stakeholders in, to then share what's going on for them. So, for example, if we have these very large destructive companies who might be some of the shareholder companies, and obviously not all, it just depends on the behavior that's going on in that company. Power is concentrated in the board. I think I was sharing this before, the board of the directors, maybe a handful of shareholders, and sort of a small executive team in that way. So they can, for example, under, I think, a lot of jurisdictional laws, hire their own auditors Now, if you're hired by someone, are you going to hold them to account, for example? So they can, and I would like to quote Sian Turnbull, who's an Australian
I was
governance
just about to
expert.
mention Shan. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really, he's shaped my thinking a lot. I really appreciate all his scholarship. But he talks about these organizations essentially being able to mark their own exams. And I love that metaphor because there's too much concentrated power. And another really influential author is let me just think, Kelly is her name. So Marjorie Kelly. Who's written a number of books, and she talks about the capital bias that goes on in societal norms that we just hold for granted. So we see, for example, capital owners, or for example, the share owners, profits need to go to them, yet other stakeholders who create value, like workers, but also suppliers or the local community that might host the organization, or perhaps the original founders of the organization who've been bought out and so forth. They all bring value. And so organizations, if you really drill down to the basics, are actually communities. Yet there's this capital bias where profits just go to this essentially one stakeholder group, and the other stakeholders don't have a voice in that space. And so because you've got that ranking pyramid structure, those voices can be ignored and the system doesn't become self-correcting. And so here's the governance piece that Sian Turnbull also talks about, as well as others, in that you need stakeholders to truly be able to share that governance in that space, because they can hold each other to account. Like peer review in a scholarly process, they'll keep you honest. And that's the piece that's missing in our modern systems.
Absolutely. And governance is a really emerging field. So it's getting more traction these days. But if you bring governance back to its simplest form, and if you base it in nature, governance is what governs us. And so we could think about that and apply that to our physical body and to nature. And one of the forces that we're continually subjected to on planet Earth is the force of gravity. So you could say that gravity governs us. And if people are having difficulty applying what a governance model should be in an organization, then you could think back to, okay, well then how does my body apply itself on the earth when it's got gravity dealing with it? And we know if you lean forward or you lean back or you stand up or you stand on one foot, your body has to self-regulate to actually cope with that. It's no different in a corporation. Corps in French means body. Corporation, apart from the legal status that we talked about before, is a body of people. And they're trying to work out their homeostasis. They're trying to work out how do we keep going with the forces that actually are at play with us. And that's how I look at governance, in a way that we get out of the head and we get into the physical body of the understanding of it. And referring to Sian Turnbull's work again, what Sian recommends is creating an advisory board that's separate to the board. So then the board is accountable to itself. Because as Yolanda was explaining, otherwise what you tend to have in governance is you've got a board and a CEO if it's a company, if it's a large company, and then you've got the management team under that, and you've got the workers. And as she explained, no one's really going to call anyone out because everyone's employed working towards the same goals. Putting an advisory board externally to that doesn't have anything to do with the other management structures is a way that Sian's research shows that the company can be more accountable, and the different segments within the company can be more accountable to each other as well. Thanks for bringing him up, because it was actually on my mind just as you said it.
Yeah, no, he's amazing.
Yeah.
And just to I guess add to what you're saying, Susan. So Sian, I think, did a PhD, or he did an in-depth study of Mondragon Corporation in Spain, which is a collective of currently over 90 smaller worker co-ops. And so they have this structure of different councils that it's a network structure that then hold each other to account. And it's in a federated model. So that's one way to go. Other models exist around the world. There's an amazing company in Holland called Buurtzorg. Buurt means neighborhood, zorg means to care. It's a nursing, in-home nursing company. Now, they are basically a network of small teams of up to 12 nurses or care workers. They run almost completely independently, with access to coaches and assistance from head office. They've literally taken over, I think, 60% of their industry in Holland because it's been so successful and everyone wants to work for them. They've just won
Could
award
you,
after award.
would you mind spelling that or putting it into chat
Yes, I'll
for
put that
those
into,
of us who can't say it with that beautiful accent that you have, just so we
uh,
can capture that?
yeah, absolutely.
And
And I've,
then I'm working you hard here, Yolanda, but once you put that in chat, can we move on and just give about 2 to 3 minutes to profit? Because we have sort of talked about it, but we'll use profit to round off the next 3 minutes and then we'll go to questions.
absolutely, absolutely.
I was just going to say something. Now now it's left my mind. What was it? No, it's gone. It'll come back. Completely gone.
Yeah, if you remember, we'll come back around to it, Susan.
Yeah.
But just so then going to profit, and of course this is like a nested thing. It's all tied in together because,
I remembered.
oh, go right ahead, Susan.
We were talking about examples of governance systems, and I was going to mention the New Economy Network of Australia.
Yeah,
I was
please.
going
Yeah,
to mention
absolutely.
NENA. Isn't that funny? Yeah. If you go onto NENA's website and you look at the governance tab up the top, and you'll see how it's actually been organised. When NENA was formed back in 2018 and then registered in 2019, about 18 months was spent with, I forget how many people, but around about 40, I think, spent hours and hours and hours looking at the best governance model to use for the organisation that NENA has become. And so the actual structure underpinning the great work that NENA puts out, I know I'm biased because I'm on the board, but the structure underneath that is a brilliant governance model. It's something I'm very proud to be part of and something that I would love to see more people look at, and perhaps we might even run a webinar particularly on that in the future. So that's what was on my mind, was just saying that NENA has that fabulous interconnected, a little bit like a beehive. We can all go out and pollinate the world with good resources, but a bit like a beehive, the way it's been set up. It's not a dominance model or a hierarchical model at all.
And it's like that little circle in the partnership model, and Buurtzorg is a very similar structure to NENA in that space. So you know they work. These organisations have been around for quite some time.
Yeah.
So trying to, I know we've only got a couple of minutes, Susan. So coming back to profits, then of course, profits breathe life into organizations. Everyone needs money to survive. So profit is not the issue. The issue is the maximizing of profits so that, basically you just destroy the world around you. And Marjorie Kelly warns that the current system, the way it's structured, and that this is part of the change making that we need, is that basically these big corporations are now eyeing off new resources because they need to grow and grow under this model, and so that they're eyeing off water commons or land commons and trying to commercialize those. And basically, there's this risk of essentially colonizing everything and removing those public goods.
And two others as well. One is deep sea mining, and the other is the moon, which is already being mined. And if you'd like to know more about Declaration of the Rights of the Moon, the AILA website has that sitting on it. But I was shocked to find out a couple of years ago that the moon has already been mined and there are already corporations laying claim to the moon. And then the deep sea mining, I was watching it from a business point of view and a pitching point of view as to someone who is being touted as being a really incredible entrepreneur and some fantastic work he was doing. Extremely good looking, charming young person. And then I watched the whole pitch through, and what he was actually pitching were these great big pebbles on the sea floor. And in mining those, when they break them up, they get particular minerals that we're starting to run low on. And it just, personally, I found that really shocking that deep sea mining could be a thing, because we know what's above the seabed and how much it impacts all of our lives as a commons. Yeah.
Oh, it's crazy, Susan.
Yeah.
So coming then to wrap up, what can we do about this stuff? Because it's a juggernaut at the moment, and so
Yeah.
and from standing on the shoulders of these scholars, and many more scholars, that there are two pillars that we would need to focus on. So there's three spheres of social change that Gandhi was talking about in his amazing change making. The top one is stop the harm. So we must find ways to actively participate in our democracies, to organised community organising, joining organisations like NENA, to work with others, to find ways to educate others, and also stop the harm. So essentially changing the laws that are allowing this to happen. And the other piece of work that I want to focus on in our conversation today is building the alternative. So the cooperatives and the community ownership and the community control, that localisation, buying local goods, that awareness of localness, that's the other key piece of work. And then changing the self is then how those relational dynamics on how we act with each other. Because if we want to do change making, we need to do that with compassion. If we come in with what's termed traumatic rage, people get angry, and as soon as they get the floor on something that they can just burst out and overflow, that undermines our ability to create change. So coming in with compassion, coming in with orientations like nonviolent communications and so forth is in that sphere. But two pillars: stop the harm, so get those laws changed if we can, and building the alternative is an invitation to you to become part of that space. Check.
And read the labels of your food and your goods to see where they're being produced and created and grown. That's really important. I actually find terms like shop local can be a little bit meaningless, but when you actually look at that burger and you think, where did it come from, and you break down the ingredients, it brings it back a little bit more closely to things that you potentially could change as well. Other actions to take would be to have a look at the NENA website. I'm going to recommend that. There's a heap of resources on there in webinars that have been run. If you are listening to this before October 2025, seriously think about attending the NENA conference up at Broadbeach between the 10th and the 12th of October. We will get experts like Yolanda talking a lot about different ways that we can help to build thriving economies. And in the next couple of weeks maximum, NENA is opening up one of its new hubs. So NENA has a variety of different hubs, which are sectoral or interest groups that people are passionate about. And then people of like minds join a hub, and then you get to talk about really fascinating topics, but in more depth as well. There is a financial literacy and economic literacy hub starting up, which I'm going to be helping to support. And so I'd recommend that if this is an area of interest to you, that you keep your eye on that as well, or email us at nena@neweconomy.org.au to find out more about it. So thank you very much for attending Strengthening Local Economies, just a 45-minute snapshot of something we could talk about for days. Anyone want to ask one question as we wrap it up? I'm looking at chat here.
And Susan, I wonder, I can stay a few extra minutes if, a bit of an after session hangout, if folks want to ask questions. I would be happy to stay.
Okay, that sounds great. Just looking at this.
Martin?
Yes, Martin's question. So what we'll do is, if you look in the chat, you can see that JP has kindly put in some conference information for you. Also a reminder from someone to say that the call for proposals is open for one more day. So if you'd like to speak at the NENA conference, I wasn't expecting to say that, you're welcome to submit just a 200-word proposal for that, and that closes on the 1st of July. So you've still got one more day. If you'd love to speak on this type of topic, go for it. And let's have a look at Martin's question. Martin said, and I'll read it and you can answer it, Yolanda, and then we will finish up. You mentioned that they weren't sure how we moved from partnership to dominance, and that there were a number of theories. I would think nailing this down is critical to advising how we move back. What do others think? Off the top of my head, I would be looking into Indigenous economics, which is another topic that NENA talks a lot about. But apart from Indigenous economics and going back to that smaller type of local economy, what would you recommend, Yolanda? Finishing up
Absolutely.
on this.
And I think, Martin, there are two parts to answering your question. So there, historically in anthropology, archaeological records, one of the theories is that there was a climate change. There was desertification happening in part of I think African region, if I remember right. Isla writes about that in her book, and so there were these resources became very scarce, and so these hordes came in and started attacking other communities, and it just escalated out. But you know, the science is still out in that space. There are other similar hypotheses around, but to actually move back into partnership, that is well established. And as Susan says, Indigenous people around the world have kept those practices alive, well and truly alive. Practices like sociocracy, which is a form of peer governance. Socios means companion. So peer decision making, non-violent communication practices. So practicing communication with a non-judgmental mindset. And Isla goes into spheres of influence as well. So gender equality, equality within the family, equality in economics, and also in terms of communication. So how our media and narratives are shared. So there are definitely established structures out there that can get us back in really practical ways.
And really interestingly, that Greek term oikonomia, within that apparently is the word enough. So enoughness was present. So in the household, there was the concept of enough, whereas chromatistics is towards maximizing growth and continuing. So if you look back at Australian Indigenous economy and looking at them supplying their own needs, it was a self-regulating system where they didn't outstrip the needs that country could provide for them. They had particular and very strict and very well-defined laws around that. So we're coming back in a way to go from a dominance model back to a partnership model again, looking back towards those original understandings of how the planet and people can actually work in together. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for staying with us, even though we've gone a couple of minutes over time. Yolanda, thank you so much for being publicly in conversation with me. It's the first time we've done this publicly, but I know we talk a lot between the two of us. And Sarah, thank you for supporting us as well today. Any parting words from you, Yolanda, today?
Oh, just so appreciative of sharing some of this knowledge, because if we stay on our own, we're never going to create change. It's sharing that knowledge and then acting together in public. That's how we, going to protect our precious planet, which is in danger. So grateful to be with like-minded folks today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for attending. Bye.